Mr. Moretti, she's fighting for her life, and she keeps saying your name." The words hit Luca Moretti harder than any threat ever had. For 3 seconds, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast said nothing. He stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, one hand wrapped around a glass he had forgotten to drink from, while 20 armed men waited silently behind him for orders concerning a rival family moving against his territory. Luca Moretti was 38, wealthy enough to buy buildings without asking the price, feared enough that men twice his age lowered their voices when he entered a room, and cold enough that even his closest allies had stopped asking whether he had a heart. But the hospital nurse on the phone had just spoken a name that made his fingers tighten around the glass. "Who is she?" Luca asked, his voice dangerously calm. There was hesitation on the line. "Her name is Grace Bennett. She was brought in 20 minutes ago after collapsing outside our emergency entrance. She had no emergency contact listed, but she kept whispering Luca. Luca Moretti. We found your number in her phone." Luca's face changed so slightly no one else would have noticed, but his consigliere did. Grace Bennett, the curvy waitress from Bellini's cafe, the woman who had spilled coffee on Luca's $4,000 suit 3 weeks earlier, stared straight into his eyes while everyone else panicked and said, "I'm sorry, but if you're going to have me fired, at least let me finish serving the elderly couple at table 6 first. They've been waiting 20 minutes. No trembling apology, no flirting, no attempt to impress him, just concern for 2 strangers. Luca had remembered her ever since. Grace was 31, plus size, soft-featured, and accustomed to people deciding who she was before she ever opened her mouth. Customers sometimes ignored her while calling thinner waitresses the pretty ones. Her manager gave her the worst sections because he claimed she did not have the look for expensive clientele. Her former fiancé had left 2 months before their wedding, telling her he wanted someone who would make him look successful. Grace had swallowed every humiliation, paid her overdue rent, cared for her widowed mother, and still slipped free slices of pie to lonely customers who could not afford dessert. Luca knew all of that because after their first meeting he had quietly ordered someone to find out who she was. What he had never discovered was why Grace had his private number. "Prepare the cars," Luca said. His consigliere, Marco, frowned. "We have the Russo meeting in 40 minutes. If you miss it, they'll see weakness." Luca placed the untouched glass on the table. Then let them see whatever they want. 10 minutes later, 3 black SUVs stopped outside St. Catherine's Hospital in a cold November rain. Luca entered through the emergency doors wearing a charcoal overcoat, his security detail spreading behind him, and conversations seemed to lower automatically as people recognized him. A nurse hurried forward. "Mr. Moretti, where is Grace Bennett?" Before the nurse could answer, a man near the reception desk laughed under his breath. He wore a restaurant manager's badge. Luca recognized him from Bellini's. "Grace," the man said, "figures she'd create drama just to get attention. Woman's always been desperate for somebody important to notice her." Luca slowly turned. The lobby became silent. He walked toward the manager until only a few feet remained between them. "What did you say?" The man's smile vanished. Luca did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Her name is Grace Bennett. You will use it with respect." Then Luca turned back toward the nurse as if the man no longer existed. "Take me to her." The nurse swallowed nervously. "There's something else you need to know." Luca stopped. "What?" She lowered her voice. "Miss Bennett didn't collapse because she was sick, Mr. Moretti. Someone had been following her for almost 2 miles. Luca's expression hardened. "Who?" The nurse looked toward the closed trauma room doors. "We don't know, but before she lost consciousness, she gave us this." She placed a small silver flash drive in Luca's palm. Written across it in Grace's handwriting were 5 words that turned his blood cold. "The traitor is inside your house." Luca stared at the silver flash drive in his palm, then closed his fist around it. "Nobody touches this except me." His voice was quiet, but every man in the hospital lobby understood it as an order. Marco stepped closer. "We should get you somewhere secure before we open it." Luca's eyes shifted toward the trauma room doors. Grace first. The nurse led him down a fluorescent hallway where the smell of antiseptic mixed with rain drifting in whenever the emergency entrance opened. Luca's men followed until he stopped outside room 214 and turned. No one enters this floor without Marco's approval. Even hospital staff? One guard asked. Luca looked at him once. Especially anyone we don't recognize. Inside the room, Grace Bennett looked nothing like the stubborn waitress who had once argued with him over an elderly couple's dinner. Her dark curls were damp against the pillow, a small bandage rested near her temple, and an IV ran into her arm. The hospital gown could not hide the softness of her full figure, but Luca barely noticed anything except how still she was. A bruise circled one wrist. Something cold moved behind his ribs. "What happened to her?" he asked. Dr. Harris, the attending physician, kept his tone professional. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and had a head injury consistent with a fall. Her vitals are improving, but she needs observation. Whoever followed her frightened her badly enough that she ran nearly 2 miles. Luca's jaw tightened. Grace had run through cold November rain, injured and terrified, yet instead of calling police or family, she had carried evidence to him. "Can she hear me?" "Possibly. Keep it calm." The doctor left, and for the first time in years, Luca Moretti found himself alone in a room without knowing what to do. He could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without blinking. He could silence a room of armed men with one sentence. But standing beside Grace's bed, he hesitated before touching her hand. Finally, he pulled the chair closer and sat. Grace. Her eyelids moved. "It's Luca." Her fingers twitched beneath his. He leaned closer. "You're safe." Grace opened her eyes just enough to find his face. Confusion came first, then fear. "You came." The words were barely audible. "You kept saying my name." A weak, embarrassed smile touched her mouth. "That's unfortunate." To Luca's surprise, he almost smiled back. "Why did you have my private number?" Grace's expression changed. "Your business card." Luca frowned. "Luca, I never gave you one." "You didn't." She swallowed painfully. "A man left it at the cafe yesterday, said if anything happened, I should call you." Luca went completely still. "What man?" Before she could answer, Grace squeezed his hand with unexpected urgency. "The drive. Did you get it?" "Yes." "Don't open it on your network." Luca's gaze sharpened. "Why?" "Because that's how they'll know where you are." Outside the room, Marco appeared through the glass panel, clearly waiting. Luca stood, but Grace refused to release his fingers. "There's more," she whispered. 3 nights ago, I was closing Bellini's when 2 men took the corner booth. They thought I wasn't listening." Her breathing became uneven. Luca lowered his voice. "Slow down." "They were talking about you, about a meeting, about changing the location after your security team approved it." Luca's blood cooled. "The Russo meeting." "Tonight. What exactly did they say?" Grace looked directly into his eyes. "They said the man closest to you had already moved the pieces." Luca glanced toward Marco beyond the door. Grace immediately shook her head. "Not him. I saw Marco's picture afterward. It wasn't him." Luca looked back at her. "You risked your life to bring me this because you overheard strangers?" Her eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. "No, I brought it because one of them dropped the drive, and when he came back looking for it, he saw me holding it." Luca finally understood the bruised wrist, the chase, the terror. "You should have thrown it away." Grace gave him a tired look. "And let people die because I was scared?" Something inside Luca shifted. Everyone in his world calculated loyalty by money, fear, or power. Grace Bennett had none of those advantages, yet she had chosen courage when walking away would have been easier. He removed his overcoat and gently placed it across her blanket when he noticed her shivering. "You don't have to be brave anymore tonight." Grace looked down at the expensive coat, then back at him. "I'm not asking you to save me." "Good," Luca said softly, "because I'm asking you to let me protect you." A knock interrupted them. Marco entered, his face tense. "Luca, we have a problem. Bellini's security footage was erased 20 minutes ago." Luca rose. "By whom?" Marco held up his phone. "That's not the worst part. Someone just used Grace's employee badge to enter the hospital through the staff garage." Luca turned toward the door as alarms suddenly echoed down the hallway. Then Grace whispered the words that made him reach beneath his jacket. "Luca, that's him." "Luca, that's him." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper, but the fear in it changed the entire room. Luca moved before anyone else did. In one motion, he stepped between Grace and the door, his body blocking her from whoever stood beyond the narrow glass panel. Marco turned toward the hallway as the alarms continued to pulse through St. Catherine's Hospital, red emergency lights flashing against the white walls. At the far end of the corridor, a man in blue hospital scrubs walked toward them with his head lowered beneath a surgical cap. To anyone else, he looked like an exhausted employee rushing through another chaotic night. Grace knew better. Her fingers tightened around Luca's coat. He was at the cafe. Luca didn't turn around. "Stay behind me." The man in scrubs looked up. Their eyes met. He stopped. Then he ran. "Take him alive," Luca ordered. Marco and 2 guards moved instantly, chasing the stranger toward the stairwell. Luca remained beside Grace. That choice mattered more than any command he had given that night. The old Luca would have joined the hunt himself. The old Luca trusted no one else to finish dangerous work. But Grace was shaking, and for the first time in years, protecting one person mattered more to him than personally punishing another. "You should go," Grace said, struggling to sit upright. "He came here because of me." Luca gently pressed a hand to her shoulder. "No, he came here because someone is afraid of what you know." "That doesn't make me safer. It makes you important." Grace gave him a tired, bitter laugh. "People have spent most of my life making sure I understood I wasn't important." Luca's expression hardened, not at her, but at everyone who had taught her to believe that. Then they were wrong. Before Grace could answer, Marco returned alone. He got through the west stairwell. We locked the exits, but he had an access card programmed for restricted floors. Luca's eyes narrowed. Grace's badge couldn't do that. "Exactly." Marco handed him a tablet. "Someone upgraded it in the hospital system 30 minutes before he arrived." Grace stared at the screen. "Who can do that?" "Someone with internal access," Marco said. A second security officer approached carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside was Grace's employee badge. "We found this in the stairwell." Grace looked at it, confused. "That's impossible. Mine was in my purse." Marco's face darkened. "Your purse was logged into hospital security when you arrived." Grace's confusion became alarm. Then someone copied it. Luca's phone rang. He looked at the screen and immediately answered. "Speak." His security chief at the Moretti estate sounded tense. "Boss, we searched the West Wing like you ordered. We found a listening device inside your private office." Luca's gaze went cold. "Anything else?" There was a pause. "Yes, a second flash drive, same model as the one Miss Bennett brought you." Grace slowly looked at him. Luca asked, "Where?" "Hidden behind the family portrait in your study." Marco swore under his breath. Only a handful of people had unrestricted access to that room. Luca's closest advisors, senior guards, family. The threat was no longer outside the gates. It had been eating dinner at his table. "Cancel the Russo meeting," Luca said. "Already tried," Marco replied. "That's the problem. Russo says the meeting was never scheduled for tonight." Silence fell. Luca stared at him. "What?" Marco showed him a message. "Someone using your encrypted account arranged the meeting 3 days ago. Russo received nothing. Whoever sent you there expected you to arrive at an abandoned warehouse at midnight." Grace's face went pale. A trap. Luca looked at the clock. 10:47 p.m. 73 minutes until the meeting that never existed. Suddenly the cafe conversation made sense. Changing locations, approved security, pieces already moved. Someone inside Luca's organization had created an entire operation designed to place him exactly where they wanted him, and Grace had accidentally stolen the evidence. A hospital administrator entered quickly, followed by the manager from Bellini's. "Mr. Moretti, we have another issue." The restaurant manager pointed immediately at Grace. "I told you she couldn't be trusted. We checked the register before coming here. Nearly $6,000 is missing from the cafe safe, and Grace's access code opened it last night." Grace stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "And," he continued almost triumphantly, "the police found security footage of you meeting a man behind Bellini's 2 nights ago." Luca watched Grace instead of the manager. Hurt crossed her face before fear did. "I never stole anything." "Then explain this." The manager held up his phone. A grainy image showed Grace in the alley behind the cafe, apparently handing an envelope to a shadowed man. Marco studied it. "Looks bad." Grace turned toward Luca, and that wounded look hit him harder than accusation ever could. She expected him to doubt her. Everyone else always had. Luca stepped closer until the distance between them disappeared. "Look at me." Grace did. "I believe you." Her lips parted. The manager scoffed. "You don't even know her." Luca turned slowly. "I know enough to recognize fear, and enough to recognize a setup." He took the phone, enlarged the image, then froze. On the shadowed man's wrist was a silver signet ring bearing the Moretti crest. Only 12 men in Luca's organization had ever received one. Marco saw it too. Luca, but Grace was staring at something else in the photograph. Her entire expression changed. "Wait." She reached for the phone and zoomed in on the man's reflection in the cafe's back window. The image was blurred, but the face was visible enough. Grace's breathing stopped. Luca looked at her. "You know him?" She nodded slowly. "That's the man who left your business card." Marco leaned closer, then went completely still. Luca's face lost every trace of warmth, because the man in the reflection wasn't a stranger, a rival, or a hired assassin. He was Luca Moretti's younger brother. Luca stared at the blurred reflection until the face became undeniable. Daniel. Grace watched the colour disappear from him in a way no bullet or threat had managed to do. Daniel Moretti was Luca's younger brother, the last blood relative he still trusted, the boy Luca had practically raised after their father was killed. More than that, Daniel was one of only 3 people who knew the security codes to Luca's private study. Marco lowered his voice. If Daniel planted the second drive, he could have accessed everything. Luca said nothing. His expression became colder, but Grace noticed what everyone else missed, the slight tremor in the hand holding the phone. Betrayal hurt him. He had simply spent years becoming powerful enough that no one was allowed to see it. "Call him," Luca ordered. Marco dialed. Straight to voicemail. "Track his phone." "Already trying." Luca turned toward Grace. "Tell me exactly what happened when he gave you my card." Grace drew Luca's coat tighter around herself. 2 nights ago, I took the trash out behind Bellini's. He was waiting near the alley entrance. I'd never seen him before. He asked if I was Grace Bennett. Luca's jaw tightened. "And you answered him?" "He knew my name already." She swallowed. "He handed me your card and said, 'If you hear them mention midnight again, call Luca. Don't trust anyone else.' Then he gave me an envelope." Grace looked toward the photograph. "That's what the camera caught. I didn't give him anything. He gave something to me." "What was inside?" Marco asked. "A photograph." "Of what?" Grace's eyes moved to Luca. "You." The room went silent. "You were standing outside Bellini's 3 weeks ago, the day I spilled coffee on you. Someone had circled my face in red ink." Luca's expression changed instantly. "Where is that photograph?" "My apartment." He turned to Marco. "Send men now." Grace grabbed his wrist before he could walk away. "No." Luca looked down at her hand. "Grace, whoever followed me knows where I live. You send your people there, and you might be sending them into another trap." He studied her for a long second. Even bruised, exhausted, and frightened, she was thinking about his men before herself. "Then nobody goes until we know more." A phone vibrated. Marco checked it. "We got Daniel's location." Luca's eyes hardened. "Where?" Marco hesitated. "Your estate." Luca looked toward the clock. 11:03 p.m. 57 minutes until the false meeting. "Lock the property down." Marco began issuing orders, but Grace suddenly whispered, "Luca, wait." Her face had gone pale. "Daniel said something else. I thought it didn't matter." Luca stepped closer. "What?" "He said he'll think I betrayed him. That's the only way this works." Luca froze. Marco stopped speaking mid-command. Grace continued. "I asked what he meant, but he just told me to remember one thing. Sometimes the person who looks guilty is the person trying to keep you alive." Luca's gaze returned to the photograph, the signet ring, the envelope, the copied access codes. Daniel had made himself visible, too visible. "He wanted us to find him," Luca said quietly. Then Marco's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his face changed. "Daniel's in your study, alone." Luca took the phone. "Put him on." Static crackled for 2 seconds before Daniel's voice came through. "Luca," Luca's tone became ice. "Give me one reason I shouldn't assume you sold me out." Daniel exhaled shakily. "Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be at that warehouse." Luca's eyes narrowed. "Who's behind it?" "I can't say over the phone. Your system is compromised. Everything is compromised." "Then why involve Grace?" Luca demanded. Daniel went silent. Grace looked toward him from the bed. Finally, Daniel said, Because Grace Bennett is the only person they didn't know I trusted. Grace's breath caught. You don't know me, she called toward the phone. No, Daniel replied, but I knew what you did 3 years ago. Grace went completely still. Luca noticed immediately. What happened 3 years ago? She looked away. Daniel answered for her. Ask Grace about the highway crash outside Albany. Luca slowly turned toward her. Grace's eyes filled with shock. How do you know about that? Daniel's voice softened. Because the man you pulled from that burning car was me. Luca stared at Grace. 3 years earlier, Daniel had nearly died when his vehicle was forced off an icy road. A stranger had dragged him 20 feet from the wreck before disappearing before police arrived. Daniel had searched for that person for years. Grace whispered, I didn't know who he was. Luca looked at the woman lying beneath his coat as every piece shifted again. She had already saved a Moretti once, long before she knew his name. Then Daniel suddenly shouted, Luca, get Grace out of the hospital now! A crash exploded through the phone. Luca straightened. Daniel? Heavy breathing followed, then a different male voice came onto the line. Calm, familiar. Midnight was never about killing you, Luca. Luca's face hardened as he recognized the speaker. Then what was it about? The man laughed softly. Getting you away from her. At that exact moment, every light on Grace's floor went black. The hospital floor vanished into darkness. For 1 second, there was only the shrill pulse of backup alarms and Grace's frightened breathing. Then Luca moved. He pulled Grace from the bed, wrapped one arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the wall as emergency lights flickered red across the corridor. Stay with me. Grace's IV line pulled tight. Luca ripped the tubing free from the stand and kept her close. Marco appeared at the doorway with 2 guards. Power was cut from inside the building. Luca's face hardened. Stairwell? Compromised. A metallic crash echoed from the west end of the hall. Luca turned toward it, placing himself between Grace and the sound. Service elevator. Marco nodded. They moved fast. Grace was weak, but she refused to be carried. Her bare feet hit the cold floor while Luca kept one hand steady at her back. They reached a maintenance corridor just as footsteps thundered behind them. Luca? Grace whispered. They're coming. He opened a fire door, pushed her inside, then looked at Marco. Get her downstairs. Grace grabbed Luca's sleeve. No. Grace, this is exactly what they want, to separate us. Luca stopped. She was terrified, but she was right. He looked toward the approaching shadows, then back at her. Then we moved together. They descended 2 flights before Marco's phone buzzed with a secure message. He glanced at it and went pale. Daniel's alive. Luca took the phone. A photo showed Daniel tied to a chair inside the Moretti estate's private study. Beneath it was one sentence. Bring Grace to the old shipping terminal before midnight or your brother dies. Grace read it over his shoulder. They want me. Luca's voice dropped. They're not getting you. Then Daniel dies. That is not your decision. Grace stepped in front of him despite the pain in her face. And my life is not yours to trade either. The words stopped him. Everyone Luca knew obeyed when he spoke. Grace challenged him because she cared what happened to the people around him. I won't let you walk into that building alone, he said. I'm not asking to. By 11:31 p.m., Luca's convoy rolled toward the abandoned shipping terminal on the Brooklyn waterfront. Rain hammered the black SUVs, turning the harbor lights into streaks across the windows. Grace sat beside him wearing his charcoal coat over the hospital gown, her hands trembling in her lap. Luca noticed and quietly placed his hand over hers. You can still stay in the car. Grace looked at him. Would you? No. Then don't ask me to be braver in a different direction. Something almost warm moved through his expression. You really are impossible. I've been called worse, by people who were wrong. Grace stared at him, surprised. Luca squeezed her hand once, then released it as the vehicle stopped. Inside the terminal, yellow industrial lights hung over rusted containers and concrete floors. Daniel sat tied to a chair near the center. Behind him stood 6 armed men. And beside them was the man whose voice Luca had recognized on the phone. Vincent Moretti, Luca's uncle. The man who had helped raise both brothers after their father died. Marco breathed. Son of a... Vincent smiled. You always were slow to suspect family. Luca's face went still. You staged the warehouse meeting. I staged everything. Vincent glanced toward Grace. including the theft at Bellini's, the copied badge, the photograph. Even Daniel's little attempts to warn you helped me. Grace's stomach tightened. Why me? Vincent laughed. Because you were supposed to be disposable. Luca's jaw clenched. Vincent continued. Daniel trusted you because you saved his life years ago. I discovered that when he started searching for you again. Then Luca noticed you. That made you useful. Grace looked at Daniel, who struggled against the ropes. The drive? Daniel called out. It contains Vincent's financial records, payments to Russo intermediaries, security bribes, everything. Vincent's smile disappeared, and she stole the only copy I couldn't recover. Luca turned slightly toward Grace. You still have it? Not the one from the hospital. She reached beneath Luca's coat and removed a tiny memory card taped inside the lining. I copied it at Bellini's before they chased me. Marco stared at her. Luca almost did too. Grace swallowed. I told you I listen when people think I'm invisible. Vincent's face twisted. Give it to me. Grace stepped forward. Luca immediately moved with her. No, she said. You spent your whole life believing people like me don't matter. That's why you never noticed what I was capable of. Vincent raised his weapon. Luca stepped directly in front of Grace. Lower it. Move, Luca. No. Vincent laughed bitterly. You'd risk your empire for a waitress? Luca's answer came without hesitation. I'd burn every deal I have before I let you decide her value. Grace's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Vincent's men shifted uneasily. Marco lifted his phone. Too late anyway. The files were sent to every Moretti captain 10 minutes ago. Vincent turned sharply. What? Grace looked at Luca. You did that? Luca shook his head. Daniel smiled through a split lip. Risk she did. Grace had scheduled the upload before leaving the hospital. Vincent's own men began lowering their weapons as their phones started buzzing with proof of his betrayal. For the first time, the balance of power changed. Vincent looked around, realizing he had lost the room. Then rage replaced calculation. He grabbed Daniel by the collar and pressed the weapon against his side. One step, and your brother pays for her courage. Luca froze. Grace saw something on the floor near Daniel's chair, a loose emergency chain hanging from a cargo release lever. She understood before anyone else did. Luca, she whispered, trust me. Before he could stop her, Grace stepped out from behind him. Vincent. His eyes locked onto her. You want the card? She held it up. Come take it. Vincent shoved Daniel aside and moved toward her. Luca's entire body tightened. Grace, no. But she waited until Vincent crossed beneath the suspended cargo net. Then she kicked the release lever. The chain snapped loose, and the heavy net crashed down between them, knocking Vincent's weapon across the concrete. Marco's men surged forward. Daniel rolled away. Luca reached Grace and pulled her against him just as a single shot cracked through the terminal. For one terrifying second, neither of them moved. Then Grace felt Luca's body jerk in her arms. Luca! Grace caught him as his knees buckled, her hands pressing against his chest while panic tore through her voice. For one terrible second, she thought the bullet had gone through his heart. Then Luca looked down at his shoulder, where blood was already spreading beneath his suit jacket. I'm fine, he said through clenched teeth. That is not what fine looks like, Grace snapped, tears filling her eyes. Behind them, Marco's men had Vincent pinned beneath the fallen cargo net while Daniel, finally freed from the chair, kicked the weapon farther across the concrete. It's over, Daniel said. Every captain has the files. Vincent can't bury this anymore. Luca barely looked at his uncle. His attention stayed on Grace. Even injured, even surrounded by armed men and the wreckage of a betrayal that had almost destroyed his family, he lifted one hand and touched her cheek. Are you hurt? Grace stared at him in disbelief. You were shot, and you're asking me that? Yes. Something in her expression broke. For days, Grace had carried fear like it belonged to her. She had been followed, framed, mocked, blamed, and nearly convinced that being overlooked made her powerless. But the man everyone feared was standing wounded in front of her, asking only whether she was safe. No, she whispered. I'm not hurt. Luca exhaled as if that mattered more than the pain in his shoulder. 20 minutes later, paramedics treated him inside the terminal, while police units and trusted Moretti security secured the scene. Vincent was taken away under guard, his accounts frozen, and his betrayal exposed to the entire Moretti organization. The false accusations against Grace collapsed almost as quickly. The financial records proved Vincent's men had stolen the money from Bellini's and used her access code to frame her. The hospital badge had been cloned. The security footage had been manipulated. By sunrise, every lie built around Grace Bennett had begun to fall apart. 3 days later, Luca stood inside a private recovery suite at St. Catherine's with his left arm in a sling, ignoring 3 different doctors who had told him to rest. Grace sat near the window in a soft blue sweater and jeans Daniel had arranged to have brought from her apartment. Morning sunlight warmed her face. For the first time since Luca had met her, she looked peaceful. "Bellini's called," she said. Luca's expression darkened. "If that manager insulted you again," Grace almost laughed. "He offered me my job back. And I told him no." Luca studied her. "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't get to decide that." A faint smile appeared on his face. "You're right." That answer surprised her more than any order he had ever given. Luca crossed the room and stopped a few feet away, leaving space between them. "What do you want, Grace?" No one had asked her that in a long time. Not what she could do for them, not what she owed, what she wanted. Grace looked toward the city beyond the glass. "I want to stop living like I should apologize for taking up space." Luca's eyes softened. "Then stop apologizing." She gave him a fragile smile. "You make that sound easy." "It won't be." He stepped closer. "But you won't do it alone." Grace looked down at herself, at the body that strangers had judged before hearing her speak, at the hands that had dragged Daniel from a burning car, protected evidence while being chased, and triggered the release that saved Luca's family. For once, she did not see someone who needed to become smaller. She saw someone who had survived. Luca reached for her hand but stopped before touching it. "May I?" Grace nodded. He took her hand carefully and held it in both of his. "I spent years believing trust made men weak," he said. "Then you walked into my life and risked everything for people you barely knew." Grace looked at him. "You noticed me before any of this happened. I noticed you the day you cared more about an elderly couple's dinner than ruining my suit." She laughed softly through sudden tears. Luca lifted his good hand and wiped one tear from her cheek. "You were never invisible to me." 6 months later, Grace no longer worked at Bellini's. With Luca's support, but on her own terms, she opened a neighborhood cafe that hired women returning to work after difficult years and served free Sunday breakfasts to families who needed them. Daniel visited so often that Grace threatened to start charging him rent. Marco pretended not to enjoy the pie. And Luca Moretti, still feared by enemies and obeyed by powerful men, developed one weakness everyone around him quietly understood. Whenever Grace entered the room, his voice softened. On the cafe's opening night, Luca stood beside her beneath warm golden lights as customers filled every table. He placed his coat around her shoulders when she stepped outside into the cold, then took her hand where everyone could see. Grace smiled up at him. She was not a woman he had rescued because she was weak. She was the woman who had stood beside him when his own world betrayed him, and he was the man who finally showed her that love never required her to shrink. Their story began with a hospital call that sounded like the end, but it became the moment both of them started living differently. So here's the question. If the entire world had underestimated Grace, would you have recognized her strength before Luca did? And if you believe the right person should make you feel seen, respected, and safe exactly as you are, subscribe to the channel for more stories where danger may open the door. But courage, loyalty, and love decide who walks through it together.